Hello everyone, Dr. Reese Goodall here, and welcome to my next video on essay writing. And to complement the last video on introductions, today I want to think about conclusions, what you should be doing in them, and how you can do it really well. So what is a conclusion? Broadly speaking, it is the piece of, the part of the essay, the part of the writing that concludes your essay. It concludes the argument, it wraps up. And it's the final word. It's your chance to once again assert the claims that you've made. It's your chance to essentially lay out conclusively what you think you've done and sort of essentially summarise it. It's a chance to sort of reflect the introduction, in a sense, to say the things that I said I was going to do at the start of this essay, here's how I've done them, here's how I've demonstrated whatever I was trying to demonstrate, here's how I've made the argument that I said I was going to demonstrate. And a good conclusion does that really well. It's very clear about sort of capturing what you have done in the essay, what you've done sort of in all the preceding paragraphs, and essentially reflecting what you said you were going to do. In many essays, sort of a good introduction, a good conclusion, broadly speaking, are mirrors of each other. The introduction saying, here's what I'm going to do, the conclusion saying, here's what I did. So as I've already said, the first key part of doing an academic conclusion really well is to kind of summarise what you've already done and to reiterate it. And I think looking to your introduction is the best place for this, and broadly speaking can be good, I think, to write them at the same time. My own view is that sort of figuring out what your argument is, but then writing the main chunk of the essay, writing all that sort of the core pieces with examples and stuff, and then doing the intro and conclusion after you've done it. So you can say explicitly, here's what I'm going to do, here's what I've done, I think is really useful. But anyway, yes, summarising. So what you want to do is essentially give a tiny recap of what you've done, in the sense of not quite as rudimentary as this, but really the sort of points you're hitting are, in this essay, I argued this, and I did it via this, I looked at this case study, I used this theory, whatever. Really, almost kind of nuts and bolts. Here are the things that I said I was going to do, and here's how I did them. Here's how I demonstrated my argument. And again, sort of laying out kind of an argument that is answering the question. And in this essay, I was responding to this question, and I made this argument. I gave this answer. Don't be sort of quite as on the nose with it. But if you're taking those points, if you're coming up with a summary that speaks to the question, speaks to the argument you made and that you said you were going to make, and speaks to how you did it. I looked at these case studies, I looked at this theory, I looked at this source, whatever. Then that is generally sort of the one of the key jobs of the academic conclusion. Following the summary of your work, following after you've sort of captured everything that you did, you want to think about the implications of what you've done. And that is quite a broad category that varies depending on sort of the context, depending on the question that you've responded to. But thinking about the fact that whatever you've done doesn't exist in a vacuum. And that vacuum might be other similar works, it might be the time period itself, it might be that the thing you've looked at is a particular style, sort of how does what you've demonstrated, does it speak to something that's generally true of whatever context you've positioned your work, or is it unusual, and why might that be interesting? If you've written about, I don't know, literature, a particular author, is whatever you've unpicked in their work, is that typical of the time? Is that typical of their works? Is that typical of the genre? Is it typical of whatever? If so, how might that influence future readings? How might that influence future work in those areas? If not, what does that tell us? And what makes this work unusual? Why is that interesting? And this is a very kind of general category, and sort of it's quite hard to unpick, because, as I say, depending on what the source is, depending on what this field is, depending on what the question is, this can be thought about in so many different ways. But I think a useful way to unpick this is something that leads really into the next point. And so we move on to this last question that a strong academic conclusion will do, And it's a skill that I think is a harder one to develop, but the question of where will you go next? So no piece of academic work is sort of the end all. It is never the final word, and there is always wider relevance. And of course, given the word counts that you're going to have, somewhere probably between 1,000 to 5,000 for a sort of perhaps an undergrad essay, and you can't fit everything in. So what have you not done, and why have you not done it? And there is always an answer to that. And showing that you have the knowledge, that you're able to critically reflect on what you've not done and why, and to show what that might mean for the future. Let me give you some examples of this, because I think this is a hard skill to develop. But thinking about things like if your essay is on, let's pick an example, I don't know, gender in the books of Charles Dickens. It might be the case that you've only been able to look at 2 books, but some of the traits, some of the things you identified might be useful for thinking about the other books. And some of them might be useful for thinking about other authors of the time. And it might be the case that in the analysis you've had some interesting ideas about class, say. And you haven't been able to go into that in too much detail, but you think that would be something worth exploring. And so thinking about kind of where you have to stop, the things you've not been able to do, and sort of how, imagine someone in future was to pick up on your essay as a starting point and use it for their own work. What kind of questions might they try and answer that you haven't been able to? Having that good sense of sort of critically where your work exists and its limitations is something that is a sign of strong scholarship, and it's the kind of thing that can nudge essays into the higher marks, because it shows not just that you've got the skills to sort of conduct the analysis, but that you're thinking about the field more widely. And lastly, I would like to conclude with, I think, a key piece of advice on what not to do in a conclusion. Something that I have seen sort of a fair bit in my time marking essays, and I'll be fair, writing a few of them as well, which I think is quite a big error. It's very hard to do well, but it's quite easy to do badly. And that is bringing in entirely new arguments, bringing in entirely new sources, entirely new examples in the conclusion. The conclusion is not the space for it. The conclusion is the space for you to reflect on what you already have done in the essay. And when you're thinking about the wider context, though you're sort of zooming in and sort of looking outwards, you're not bringing anything radically new. It's the thing. So you're hinting at things that are already kind of there in the work. If you bring in entirely new stuff in a conclusion, it's very confusing to the author. Imagine that you've written something about gender in Dickens, and then in the conclusion, for the first time, suddenly you start talking about class with sort of no real sense of how it links in. It sort of essentially throws off the balance, and it's the kind of thing that essentially it's quite easy to lose marks for. So always reflect, essentially, if you're going to bring anything in a conclusion, is it something that has been set up in some capacity in the essay? You don't really want to be thinking about that. What you want to be thinking about is the summarising and then the looking more widely. Not about sort of how you can bring in new material, because if there's stuff you want to talk about in a conclusion, the question you really need to be thinking about is, does it feature in my essay already? If not, should it? And if it shouldn't, then what is the value of adding it in later on? So sort of have those questions in mind when thinking about sort of whether new material is something you want to feature. How should it feature in the main body of an essay, if indeed it should at all? So there you are. That was a little run through of conclusion writing, how to do it, the kind of questions you should be asking yourself, and the kind of things you should not be doing. And hopefully this was useful to some degree. Please do comment below if you have any tips or ideas of your own. My next video is going to be a masterclass video, so it's going to be much, much longer. It's going to be kind of a deep run through of kind of the essay writing process. It'll be much longer, and I'm going to run through sort of the kind of things that I'm thinking about when I'm doing it. Not to say my way is the only way, but I hope it will be a really useful thing. If you have ideas for videos and content that would be useful, also please do comment those below. Otherwise, make sure to like the video, make sure to subscribe, make sure to ring the bell, and I'll look forward to seeing you all in the next one. Thank you very much for watching.